Hello everybody and welcome. This is the beginning of the greatest adventure in Kerbal Space Program. And in order to have a great adventure, of course, we also have to have great transportation. But first, we see Captain Stelnitzer Kerman heading for the crew bus. And this will take her to the launch pad, where, in the tradition of great vessels like the Julishka, the first vehicle that ever was able to perform a Joule 5 mission in this universe of Kerbal kind, there is going to be another ship on the launch pad. And while the bus is revving up its motor, Stelnitzer remembers her last big mission aboard the Ozymandias, the first vehicle to ever perform a complete tour of the outer planets. This was years ago, and in the meantime, there have been a lot of technological and scientific advancements, so it was time to head back out into space and check on things. One of the technologies was new communication, therefore a new comm network was established before this mission. So who is on board? We have the same crew that was on the Ozymandias, 3 pilots, 3 scientists and 3 engineers that will head off into space for years, decades even, to perform their mission. And while the crew bus was coming around the vehicle assembly building, they finally saw their ride. Standing on the launch pad was the most advanced spaceship Kerbal kind has ever built. Many failed iterations did not pass muster, but this was the ultimate spacecraft. Its name? Invictus. Right next to the launch tower, it stands there and waits for the crew of 9 to head into space, deep space even, while the sun is starting to rise over the oceans. And while the bus makes its way further to the launch pad, the crew ponders, what new worlds or what new things are we going to discover on all those planets, all those moons that we have already visited in part, but of course, any celestial body is a huge chunk of rocks in space, so we have probably missed something, so there's a good reason to get back out there. And we shall. But first, of course, the vehicle has to be boarded. But before that, of course, we can have a little more of this beauty shot. And look at that. Right on top there in the cockpit is where Commander Stelnitzer Kerman is going to sit for quite a lot of time, probably decades, maybe even hundreds of years. Who knows? Nobody knows what this mission is going to bring, but our Kerbal crew is intrepid and not afraid of what the future brings. What it does bring now is a bit of a climb, so first they have to head into the launch tower, and then, of course, they have to get into the ship, which is done via this handy little bridge. Please don't fall off. That would be detrimental to the mission if you did. And here we go. Invictus launches into the skies. And while the vehicle rises into the skies, the crew can't help but wonder, well, things are different than they were when they were last going to space aboard the Ozymandias. The sky looks different, the oceans look different, everything looks a bit different. Well, in the Kerbal universe there are these things called mods, and this mod that provides us with these wonderful volumetric clouds is by a person named Blackrack, who made probably the best visual mod ever in existence. 2 of the best visual mods ever in existence. Scatterer, which is for great atmospheric light scattering, and of course the volumetric cloud mod that we can see here. After, of course, we witnessed a wonderful stage separation of the almost circular designed booster stage of Invictus. And what is our first target? Well, we're heading for the Purple Pain, as we like to call it here on this channel, Eve. Eve is probably one of the hardest destinations to, well, not to get to. It's really easy to get there and also easy to land on, but it's very hard to get back from it. But before we head out there, one last look at our home planet, at the planet that gave life to Kerbal kind before the Invictus heads off into space and towards its first destination. As we can see here, the boarding computer has planned a fantastically well-designed maneuver towards Eve. And in the back we have the science package, which of course has to be collected by the EVA specialist, the aptly named Dumor Kerman, who we have right here. But yes, we are now going to Eve. We can see here our planned encounter for Eve. And of course, it's easier to be in a very perfect equatorial orbit for getting back off of Eve to rendezvous back with the ship, but it's not easy to get one straight away. So there is some tinkering we have to do here and a little bit later. First, we make use of Eve's atmosphere. Well, that didn't go as planned. Again! Yes, Eve is great if you have enough heat shields or these inflatable heat shields to get an air brake maneuver and reduce your velocity without spending too much fuel. Unfortunately, the Invictus is not designed for that harsh of a maneuver, as you have witnessed before. But what do we have here? This here is the Eve lander and return vehicle, and also the science rover that we're going to utilize. This one has heat shields, and it is very much capable of punching through Eve's atmosphere to get safely down onto the ground, which we are going to witness right here. Don't worry, what's blowing up is the transfer stage, or the let's call it the space tug that was connected to it to get its orbit down so it would enter the atmosphere. And look at that, we have a sunrise over Eve's purple clouds, which make them look green, which is an interesting touch, I might add. After we ditch the first heat shield, we're now basically gliding down on the bottom one. And while we descend through the clouds, our parachutes come out and slow us down even further. This here is what I would like to call the Cloud Palace. It's a layer between somewhere around 5,000 and 10,000 meters above the surface level, and it's a beautiful, beautiful sort of cavern of clouds that is created by the visual mods, Environmental Visual Enhancement Volumetric Clouds. And here we have deployed our rover. So we have detached the rover and it's now basically on auto descent. Auto descent meaning it has parachutes and there's gravity, so it will get down to the ground somehow. In the meantime, we have to make sure that our lander and return vehicle gets down safely as well. There we can see the rover, everything looks fine. Let's just hope the rover does not fall on top of it. That was the reason why our pilots steered the lander in a bit of a direction before engaging the coupler, so it would land somewhere else. Alright, here we're going to deploy our mining equipment, because in order for all of this to be light and land more easily, we don't have any fuel on board. So we have to make it. That's why this thing has a full mining rig and will produce fuel while our brave scientist, Laythe Kerman, who is anything but, is going to explore Eve and gets more science. First we grab the science we gathered from the science package, and then we're searching for the rover, because, well, in this jungle that we find on Eve, it's hard to find. Well, of course it's hard to find because it's not even there. There we go. It's so light that those parachutes are still working to get it down, and there it is. Very gently it touched down on the surface, and this is where Laythe Kerman finds it undocks it, and goes for a ride. The main purpose of this rover, and also of another rover you will see later, is to grab these. There are surface features on the surfaces of planets and moons, and there are these scanning arms that are there to scan them and get some science. Science that we could not get in the days of Julishka and in the days of Ozymandias. That's what I meant with science and technology have evolved. All those plants and bubbles and surface features are, by the way, also part of a mysterious thing in the Kerbal universe called a mod, which is the parallax mod, which wonderfully enhances every surface on the Kerbal Space Program. And now that we have planted our commemorative flag, we are gathering all the fuel we can to perform our ascent. For that we ditched the parachutes, then we ditched the ladder, we don't need that. And here we go, we started spinning up our rotors. And after we spun up our rotors, we're going to detach all that mining equipment that we no longer need. And yeah. Again. Well, that first attempt, that does not count, right? So, of course, we are now on our way. And look at that. With the sun being so close, we get abundance of solar power. And with those 4 rotors, we are able to get through the most thickest parts of the atmosphere. This vehicle is capable of ascending on rotor power alone, on electric power alone, to up to, well, 14,000, 15,000 meters above sea level, which is here, where now the engines kick in. And yes, now we're heading out of the atmosphere, or at least on the higher parts of the atmosphere. This is still a 3-stage vehicle, by the way. This is not a slouch of a rocket. And we are on our final stage. Will it be enough? Will we be able to make a circularization across around Eve on a stable orbit? And yes, this is looking very good indeed. Speaking of looking, what you might see is, well, something you don't see. There is no docking port here, so this vehicle is not capable of redocking with the Invictus. So how is poor lazy Kerman going to get all that delicious science back to the main ship? Well, we'll see that later, because now we head to Gilly. Gilly is the moon of Eve, or rather an asteroid that did not bother to fly any further, because it's really tiny and has really low gravity, and it looks like a shrimpled up prune, and it's not really easy to work with, which you will see in a few moments. What you won't see is a lot of what I did in between, or what the crew did in between, because Dumor Kerman, he did a lot, and he's still doing a lot, because at every encounter he gets out of the spaceship and grabs all the science that has been collected and stores it in the lab. But since this is such a repetitive task, I decided to not show you every time I do that, because this video is already as long as it is, which you probably have noticed when you clicked on it. And we're now descending onto Gilly, which is really easy because, as I mentioned, the gravity of Gilly is so low. So low, in fact, that a vehicle of more than 600 tons of mass just bounced off of it. Yeah, that does not bode well for the rover, does it? But first we have to get this into a stable ground configuration. There we go, looking good. Yes. And what we can also do, which is the main reason why I landed this big ship on this tiny ball of rocks, is to get more fuel. Because we're going to need every little drop of it for our next target. Here we have the main science rover, and this little contraption is designed to, well, keep it in that lander that is at the bottom of the Invictus, which you will see in a short while how it works in actuality. But first we're going to head out of here and grab some more ground science. There we go. This is what I'm going to do on every planet, so this is also not something I will show you every time. So here we are collecting all the science, collecting seismic, collecting temperature and so on. Why do we collect it? So we can get some more, because if you already have science in there, you cannot get more. You have to first collect it and then you can use it again. Look at that. What a view of Eve. And here, of course, we also plant a flag. There we go. And now it's time to get back. You may have noticed that this is Dumor Kerman, because he is subbing for Lazy Kerman, who is still in orbit around Eve, where she will stay for a while. I think she brought enough snacks to survive. I hope. What I also hope is that someday there will be a way to drive across a surface without the wheels doing weird stuff, which is very noticeable on this little rock of Gilly, where we just collected our ground science with the attached arm. And now we're basically jumping back or flying back, because driving is rather useless. This took a long time. Driving on Gilly is not easy, it's in fact very hard, and especially with all this new ground scatter around that is provided by the Parallax mod. But now that we're back, we're just waiting for the gas tanks to fill back up again, and here we go, we're heading back up into orbit. And then, well, we're going to have to retrieve finally Miss Lazy Kerman, and of course the delicious science she brought from Eve. In order to do that, we're choosing an orbit between Gilly and Eve, where we're going to wait a bit. Why wait? Because we're using now the lander to do that rendezvous, because I want to save fuel on the main Invictus ship to have it for our next target. There we go, let's get that solar panel out so we don't lose power, get our periapsis down, because this thing here is a bit better built for exactly this type of thing, because yes, it was also designed to perform some air brake maneuvers later, when we visit some other celestial bodies. But for that to work, of course, we have to hide our sensitive equipment that would burn up when we do this. And yes, this was basically also done to save fuel, and it was done quite a few times, because if you do it too aggressively, then your ship would burn up. But the final one was a bit harsher approach, but it was fine because we already had such a low orbit. And here we have Lazy Kerman grabbing all the data from her pod and now getting back to, well, not back, but she gets to the lander. Fortunately, Dumor Kerman already vacated the crew cabin, so Lazy Kerman can now take her place in the rover or in the crew module. That will be her home for the next, well, many years. And then, of course, it was time to head back to the main ship. We get our intercept, we get our rendezvous, and then we dock ourselves back into the back. And here we go, that was a good encounter and good contact between ship and lander, and the crew is back together for Moho. Moho is the hottest planet of them all, which is not because it's so attractive, but because it is so literally hot. That is due to its closeness to the sun. And of course, now we get our encounter by performing a huge burn. Since it is so close to the sun, you need a lot of propellant to get there. And even when you get an encounter, you still need a lot to slow yourself down enough to get a stable orbit around Moho. Hello, Moho! Here is the crew of the Invictus going for a visit. We haven't met yet, have we? Well, all 9 Kerbals can say that for basically every planet and moon in the Kerbal space program except for Kerbin, because they were only at the outer planets so far, which is also a mod I probably forgot to add. What you see here is a small resource scanner that got into a polar orbit, performed an orbital survey, and now we know where we want to land, because we want to land where the resources are the most intense, and this is somewhat of a location where it should be. There is only one problem.
Again.
Yeah, I performed the descent from a way too high orbit, and my Delta V reserves were nowhere near to actually do that without crashing, because this ship has more than 6,000 meters per second of Delta V when it is full, but you need almost 4,000 or more to even get to Moho, let alone land. But land we did, and here we have the spaceship on one of the plains of Moho, basking in the hot sunlight. Look at how big that fireball is from here. And of course, we are going to refuel now, because what we plan next also requires a lot. Next up, theoretically, would be Duna, because I thought in the original plan that the crew would go to all planets in the Kerbal system, then get to the outer planets, and then when they get back, sort of as a triumphant return, in the home backyard to also do Minmus and the Mum. But let's see what really happens. First, of course, we gotta get some more of that delicious surface science. And while you can see the vehicle in the background, if you look a little bit to the right of the cockpit, you can see it over there. There you have the science arm performing its science scanning of a... well, it looks like a lava caterpillar, but this is very unique to Moho. What we also can do is perform EVA science on the ground, and Laythe tries to improve her handicap on Moho, which probably is easier because the gravity is lower. I don't know, I don't play golf. I cannot tell you what a handicap even is. Anyway, keen-eyed viewers might have noticed that the solar panels from the rovers are missing. This is due to a crash that did not make it onto the captured footage, but we have, of course, our brave engineer Denmond Kerman on board, who has repair kits and can help us with that. Yep, it's a good thing to be prepared. There we go. This is now nudging the rover back on board. And once it's back on board, there's a docking port inside that keeps it in place. Speaking of in place, this is no longer in place, the vehicle is launching, and if you notice, the engines of the lander are firing as well. Yes, I need the combined thrust of the lander and of Invictus to even get off of Moho. And while I do that, I even have to transfer some reserve oxidizer and liquid fuel from the main ship to the lander to keep those engines running. But after a while, we have gained enough thrust-to-weight ratio for the main engines, so we can finalize our orbit around Moho and still have a few thousand meters per second of Delta V left, so we can perform our rendezvous, which I hoped to do with Duna. But, well, things did not go as planned, because in order for all of this to work, I would have had to perform an air brake maneuver, and as you have seen with Eve, Invictus itself is not really suited to withstand all of that atmospheric stresses. So I had to plan
Again.
Yeah, we're going to go to Duna later, but first, we're heading back home. Well, not really, we're just driving by, so to speak. because we're going to utilize this Kerbal's mass and therefore its gravity to reduce our orbital velocity a little bit better and get into a stable configuration around it to visit, while we're there, Minmus, because then we can refuel, and from Minmus we can also grab some science, then we get to the moon, grab some more science, and then we can go to Duna, because getting to Duna from Kerbal is a lot easier than getting to Duna from Moho. And there we go, we're going to perform our maneuver to get to Minmus. And then we're just coasting until we have it. There we have it, our minty mad little rock in space. Or is it rock? From what we've heard from the developers of Kerbal Space Program 2, to get to this type of minty reflective surface, it cannot be ice. It must have been glass, because otherwise it would melt because it's too close to the sun. But yeah, I mean, we're talking about little green men in huge spaceships, so... Science? Anyone? Anyway, we're touching down here again. Well, not on this here again in general, because this ship is going to land on a lot of planets and moons. And we're going to have a lot of rover deployments, just like this one. There we go. I'm sorry, but for me, this kind of rover deployment never gets old, because I'm kind of a little bit proud of how this worked out, that I was able to put a full science rover with capability of getting a crew report, atmospheric analysis, temperature, seismic, gravioli detector, material study, mystery goo, scanning arm, etc., into a lander that can get it to basically anywhere except Eve. And yeah, that golf ball probably went into orbit. What's not going into orbit, I hope, is my rover, but skating across Minmus is a bit tricky, as you can see here, because the brakes are not really working and the friction is not really working. Yeah, it's almost like somebody in the developers who developed the rover reels is very much into lubrication. Well, now that's done, we're going to power slide back to our main ship. There we go. We're getting some momentum and... slide. Yeah, I mean, it's fun to do that on a flat surface. It's not fun when you want to stop somewhere and grab some science and are a little bit short on time. But we have enough time here because we are going to get some more fuel. This has to be filled up to the brim before we can get back into orbit, as we can see here. Yeah, performing our gravity turn, which we can do a lot earlier than if this has an atmosphere, because the main thing we have to cancel out, as Newton already knew, is the horizontal velocity. And now we're heading to the moon. It's gray. Yeah, that's basically what it is. It's also the biggest moon of the Kerbal system, and we're going to utilize the lander again to go there, do our science thing, and come back. By doing this, we even increase the capabilities of Invictus, the main ship, because when the lander has burned off more fuel, it is not something that the main ship has to carry around, so its range is increased by that. By the way, the lander, I forgot to mention that earlier, this lander is called Nelson, and the Eve lander is called Winnie. If you're a bit familiar with recent or the 20th century history, then you might know that Invictus is a poem that was often recited by Nelson Mandela during his incarceration while he was fighting against apartheid in South Africa. And, well, his first name was Nelson, and his wife's first name at the time was Winnie. So Winnie and Nelson are the Invictus landers. And here we see Nelson touching down on the surface of the moon. The moon or the man? Yeah, that's an age-old debate that I'm not going to solve here and don't want to get into here either. What I do want to get into here is talking about how beautiful this looks, which is also thanks to the parallax mod, which makes all the surfaces of Kerbal Space Program a lot prettier. And this is the reason why I wanted to make this series, or realize this series before Kerbal Space Program 2 comes out. I want to pay homage to the game, to more than 10 years of a wonderful thing that gave us countless hours of joy, and I wanted to present it in basically the best version that it is in. Because it has never looked as good. It was never as, let's say, feature complete as it is now, because now with all the ground science and the other mechanisms that weren't there when I did my previous series, I think I can now offer something that is a rounded experience and that will maybe be looked at in a few years and people will say, hey, remember KSP1, that was a great time. Including saying goodbye to golf balls on other planets. Yeah, not sure what the reasoning behind this was, but yeah, there was a NASA astronaut, I think I remember, who played golf on the actual moon, not the Kerbal moon. What they did not do is use this scanning arm, because they did not have that back then in the 60s. So what we're doing here again is scanning our rock. This little rock, and getting the science also from a crater we have here. Yeah, there are multiple surface features on every moon and every planet. I was not able to find all of them because it's very tedious to do. This crater just popped up and I was, hey, cool, a crater. Now I can scan that as well. I didn't really search for it. It was just there. And now we can head back to the lander now that we have fulfilled our mission here. Which is now hanging, sort of. I mean, that looks fun. Look at that. Magnets! Yeah! Alright, now we have finally a magnetic lock. We can get the rover back on board. We don't necessarily need to close the cargo bay, but I don't know, I feel better with closed cargo bays when taking off from any other surface, and that's what we just did. Alright, now that we're airborne or spaceborne, we can retract those long things that stood out from the landing legs. A little bit of explanation is in order for those. Since the lander is rather heavy, because it is designed to also get back into orbit from Tylo and also from Laythe, the lander is rather heavy, but it has a small or sort of small footprint. So if you land on anything but a really flat surface, you're going to tip over. In order to prevent that, these tiny 4 additional feet, so to speak, are helping. And now, yes, we're going to Duna, and it is later, as I mentioned before. Alright, this is now the big one, because I don't know about you guys, but for me Duna is kind of special. It's such a close analog to Mars that it really feels like visiting our neighbor in space when doing a mission to Duna. Now we can do our circularization burn, or stabilization of the orbit burn, so to speak. And we are not doing it as an air brake maneuver, because I don't want anything to explode. We also have way more than enough propellant to perform all of this. And yes, the lander still has enough fuel after that moon encounter to get back from Duna. Here we see the feet again. And again, we can perform our air braking to reduce our orbital velocity. And what we see here is also from the volumetric cloud mod, from environmental visual enhancement, the next version, because we're seeing dust storms on Duna. And we barely got by that one. So here we have our parachutes, but they're not really useful because Duna's atmosphere is so thin that we actually also need the engines to perform a propulsive landing. But they're good to keep us stable in the orientation that we need. And now that we've done that, we can, of course, continue with our exploration. And you see the lander gliding in the background. Yeah, surface friction is a bit of an issue in Kerbal Space Program. You can't really plan for it, but when it happens, you have to know how to work around it. And it is going to be very interesting to see how that is solved in Kerbal Space Program 2. The nice thing about this mission was I was able to rely on so many past experiences I had with the game, for instance with the Ozymandias and the Julishka and other missions. So I was able to make informed decisions about the design of the vehicles, but still, yeah, there is the problem of the surface interacting with the wheel. Look at that! There's an 80-ton lander just gliding across the surface of Duna, because there is basically no friction. Everything is like ice. Yeah, you're absolutely right. We are not going to deal with that any longer. We're going to get off of this planet. And while the sun is slowly setting on the plains of Duna, or the dunes of Duna. By the way, the rover earlier was worming around on Duna. Duna, worm, sandworm, haha, get it? Yeah, bad joke, I know, I'm sorry. What I'm not sorry for is this beautiful ascent. And Laythe Kerman and Danmond Kerman are now heading back to the main crew on the Invictus, where of course Captain Stelnitzer Kerman is waiting for their return. And here we have it. There's our main ship. We have a good rendezvous. And after retracting all the panels and getting our docking port ready, we head back inside and look at the magnificence of Duna with all of those dust clouds swirling around across the surface. Heading back inside and securing the lander with the main ship. Well, now that's done, we need Katica Kerman or Katica Kerman. I don't know, there's two C's in there. How would you pronounce it? I call her Katica. So what Katica Kerman is doing, she's the lander engineer and she has to repack the parachutes because we're going to need them at a later stage. And as is proper for engineers, she has to squeeze through some tiny tubes, or not so tiny, but she has to squeeze through tubes to get to where she can do the repairs, or in this case, the repacking of the chutes. Come on, get out there. Just because your head is so big does not mean you can't get through there. And yes, we now go to Ike. Ike we like, because it looks nice, at least on the surface. To get there, of course, we have to perform another maneuver. And once that is done, we're going to land on Ike and get some science. By now, you should know how this works. The Invictus gets to a planet, it gets the science from the planet. If necessary, it refuels, which it's going to do here. That's why we get the probe out, get it into the polar orbit, and then see where the resources are. And most of them are in the South Pole region, so we have to... Well, basically I could have inclined the entire vehicle already, then I would have saved myself the entire maneuvering of the small ship, but yeah, it is what it is. Stelnitzer Kerman looking at the surface of Ike while performing the landing burn. And here we are. We are closing down to the surface of Ike, and while we do that, we realize there are some spiky things on the surface of Ike. These red spikes are mysterious and foreboding, and we don't really know a lot about them, so what a great way to get some more science and discover what they might offer us. And of course, as I mentioned, we need some fuel, because the next target is a bit further away. But first, let's have a closer look at those crystals. Shiny! Oh well, let's get a flag up there. There we go. And then, of course, also do our commemorative golf ball clubbing. Now that's all done. We try to... Oops. Well, that didn't go well. Okay, but... Luckily, this rover has a few tricks up its sleeve, including getting itself back up on its feet. Yay, I'm just glad I don't have to repair the solar panels again, but yeah, that would have also been possible, so yay for that. Alright, look at that little red thing. This is a Duna ejector. So basically what it is, it's a rock that was ejected, that's why it's called ejector. It was ejected from Duna and landed somehow on Ike. But why was it ejected, and how, and when? We don't know. That's why we're scanning all of this and bringing it back to Kerbal for analysis. Alright, so we now have a huge crystal formation over here. And of course, lazy Kerbal, who is anything but, wants to explore that. That's why she's so excited she makes some pirouettes in the air. And while she's climbing up the crystal structures, she realizes, why do I have to climb? I can use my jetpack, which is exactly what she does. But suddenly the mysterious crystal does some weird things, and the crystal has rejected Lazy. And while Lazy thinks about her life choices while tumbling to the ground, she was finally able to save herself with the EVA pack. Now that that's over, let's head back to the stalk or crystal we originally used. And how far can we hit the golf ball from here? Well, we maybe hit the ship? Who knows, we'll have to ask Stelnitzer and the others when we get back, because it was so far away we could not see the golf ball hitting. We also could not hear if it would hit, because, yeah, there are no sounds in space, or when there is no atmosphere to be more precise, and Ike does not have any of that. And again, we're waiting for the fuel to be replenished from the resources of Ike's surface, and now we're heading back. This was now the second gray thing we were landing on. The first one was the Mun, this was the second, and as is mostly in life, all good things are three. Yes, we're heading to the next gray thing. It is called Dres. In order to do that, we have to of course perform another burn. There we go. And yes, we're getting a new encounter with Dres, which was, well, a bit harder than I imagined, but it worked out fine in the end. And here we see Invictus and Dres closing in on each other. If you notice the label Invictus Trifecta 2, why Invictus Trifecta and why Invictus Trifecta 2? Well, I did a video on all the previous iterations of this spaceship, so you might want to check that out to know more about it. What we also want to know is, where is the best place to land to get the most resources? And as luck would have it, one of the most resource-rich spots is at the Scar, as I like to call it. Call it. This is the Dres Canyon, one of the more prominent surface features in the solar system. And we're going to try to land right inside. And now, the most Kerbal landing ever. Yeah, hey, we made it. Yeah, there was a little bit hairy in between, so I almost thought I didn't make it. Speaking of making it, will that golf ball make it to the top of that ridge? Well, we don't know, so we're going to have to investigate. That's why we have a rover, so we're heading back, not back, we're heading up there and see what we can find. What we do find in between is another surface feature which we can scan with our scanning arm. And once again we have to use the technique of stabilizing ourselves with one of the wheels so we don't slip around. And look at that, we can have a look at Invictus recharging its tanks, and we can also have a look at the rover arm performing the science in between. Isn't that nice? Windows are such a great thing, am I right? Alright, after we drove somewhere else and got some more science from another biome, which I am not going to show here because, as I said, this video is already so long and it's basically some more grey stuff. We're heading back up again, leaving behind nothing but a flag and a golf ball. I wonder what handicap Lazy Kerbal will have after she returns to Kerbal. Probably a very bad one because she's no longer used to that gravity. Speaking of gravity, Tylo. Yes, this is a hard nut to crack because it is so huge that it has a lot of mass and therefore also high gravity, which makes it hard to land on and return from. What you see here is the Jewel gas giant and all of its 5 moons. What we do here is we want to get a maneuver that gets us into a circular orbit. First we have to adjust way out there, then in between, and then do the maneuver at Tylo, which takes a lot of delta V, but we have enough to do so. But the problem is, well, Kerbal Space Program's maneuver planning, those planned maneuvers, they're a bit like the pirate rules. They're more like suggestions, if you know what I mean. So you can plan 5 maneuvers ahead, but after you've done the first one, you really have to check on what the rest of them have done. And here as well, I have to adjust a bit more because everything looks different now. But we have 2 periapses now. So, if you want to experiment with gravity assists and gravity brake and gravity acceleration, slingshot maneuver, all of that, it's a really good idea to do that in the Jewel system because it's sort of like a miniature solar system and you can use all those moons really well to kind of see what happens when you do an orbit around one and get out there and use the gravity and mass of the other one to increase your orbit, reduce your orbit. Basically what we did first was we got our stable orbit around Jewel, but just flying by Tylo, and Tylo's gravity grabbing us so hard that we were captured around the gas giant. But what we now have to do is get ourselves in a circular orbit around Tylo, because we're going to land on that and we're going to return from that, and the margins for that are very slim. So yeah, this is going to be a little bit tricky, and I had to do a few orbital passes until I had this circularization going on. Now we once more see do more Kerbal. I chose this perspective because you see the Kerbal for size basically, since we don't have a banana here. And look at that, Jewel in the background, Tylo below us, and a magnificent spaceship in between. Isn't that great? Even if this is my last mission in Kerbal Space Program 1, my last big one, I wanted this to be something to remember. So I as I mentioned, I used the currently best visual mods that are around, and I tried to build the best spaceship I could. This is the ultimate mission for me. And here again, we need our landing legs and the landing leg helpers. What we also did, we basically gutted Invictus of its resource capability or resource creation capability, and now we're trying to land on Tylo. It's not good. Again! Yeah, the first time around I did my suicide burn a bit too late, and therefore we ran out of fuel and crashed into the surface. But fortunately this time I waited a little bit longer, and since the vector engines are powerful enough to stop us in time, we were able to get down to a safe and sound landing. There we go! And we didn't even fall to the ground, thanks to those landing lag extenders. Alright, speaking of extension, we're going to extend the rover, and here we can finally drive properly, because Tylo has almost the same gravity as Kerbal, so the wheels now kind of work. There we go. And after we have done that and get the rover into position, we have to do a few more other stuff. Of course, get the science, and here we need the ladder, because, as I just said earlier, Tylo's gravity is rather big, or large, high? What adjective do you use for gravity? Is it high gravity, large gravity? Anyway, we have to plant our flag, we have to perform our science, and this time we have a banana, but not for scale, but for smashing, and we hurt our fingers a little bit, but yeah, fortunately we have some gloves. Alright, we had to use the ladder to get back onto the rover because Tylo's gravity is so high. I'm choosing high. What I'm also choosing is to turn off the lights, because we're already so far out from the sun that the solar panels are, well, they are working, but not as effective as they would when we would be closer to the sun and the inside of the solar system. Luckily, I also planned for that, and there is a fuel cell on the rover that also produces fuel. Well, no, it doesn't produce fuel, it utilizes the fuel in that little gold tank, in that dumpling tank, to produce some more energy. Well, electricity, actually. And now we get the rover back on board. Why don't I attach it with the wheels extended? Well, if you dock something with wheels to something bigger without wheels, then the wheels will sort of try to kind of carry the entire weight of the entire vehicle, and they will destroy themselves, and we don't want that. What we do want is more fuel, and that's what we're getting here. Yeah, look at those moons dance above. And once we got all the fuel that we can get, because the tanks are now filled to the brim, we're going to retract everything. Luckily, Tylo doesn't have an atmosphere, otherwise it would be really awkward, because all of this is going to produce a ton of drag. And now it's time to get back up to the Invictus. And thanks to the mighty vector engines, we have enough thrust to do so. And here again, as I already mentioned on Minmus, we're going to perform our gravity turn really early so we can get most of the horizontal velocity. And look at that! I probably overshot this a little bit. Again! Yeah, that rendezvous was a bit intense, but fortunately there is just a thing called a quick save, and I made copious use of that. Basically, for what you see here and what you see next is going to be bop. And yeah, we're heading to the next moon of the Joule system. This little brown nugget is way out there and in a highly inclined orbit, so it's a little bit harder to get there, but if you know what you're doing, or if you have a transfer window planner mod, as I do, then it's easy to do, or at least easier, because at least you know in which direction and with approximately what amount of delta V you have to perform your maneuver. And here we go, and again we're going to get the scanner into a perfect polar orbit, and scan Bob for resources, which we now have done. And whoa, there's a lot there, but we're going to make a cutoff to only show the most abundant resource places. And we have something close to the North Pole, which is what I want to land on. Because I want to... well, I heard there is something on Bob. Well, of course, I know what is on Bob because I already found it in the past, but the Kerbals in this vehicle have not found it yet. The 9 brave crew of the Invictus don't know what they have to expect up there, but they know they have to explore it. And they also know they have to slide down inclined surfaces because the friction is not available. But what is available is a beautiful view of Jewel of Laythe. I think we can also see Vall there, and Tylo is currently hiding. And yes, this is now going to get refueled again, because we're going to need all the fuel again in the lander to get to Laythe. So basically we used the entire fuel of the lander to get to Tylo's surface, then we used almost all the fuel in the lander to get back off from Tylo, and now we're going to use all the fuel in the lander to get to the surface and back from Laythe. Speaking of surface, we're scanning this surface feature here. There we go, and now we're heading back north until we find something. And this something turns out to be a dead baby kraken. So what is it, and why is it here, rather, and how did it come here, and why is one of its eyeballs missing? We don't know. Maybe Kerbal Space Program 2 will have some answers for this. Maybe we will have some more science we can gather here, because there's no new science that we can get from this kraken. But what we can do here in honor of its sacrifice is plant a flag and then spin around uncontrollably, because game's gonna game, and the kraken just influenced with its maybe still latent mind powers how this Kerbal moves. And that's why it spun around. Of course, that was the reason. Nothing else. Alright, now that we're back here, we can continue our mining operation and wait for Invictus to be full. And not just Invictus, as I said, also the lander. And when that is done, as we can see here, we get back up into orbit to head to our next destination. Only 3 more to go in this video, don't you worry. Laythe. Yeah, this is one of my favorite destinations. And before we get there, of course, we have to perform our usual song and dance of getting out of the original orbit to run Bob, get around a few other orbits. I heard you like orbits, so I have more orbits for your orbit. And here we have multiple periapses. Why is that? Well, we're going to use, as I mentioned earlier, the trick of, or at least the feature of utilizing gravity assists to reduce our orbit further so we can get closer to Laythe and don't have to expend as much fuel. So this is going to make everything easier in the long run. Alright, now we have to perform a burn because we have to get captured over here. There we go. And look at that, it almost looks like home for the crew, with all that blue and the clouds, but not with that green gas giant in the sky. Yeah, that was a beautiful reveal of Jewel there. But what we're revealing now is the lander, and it is going to head down to the surface, which is exactly what it is designed for. It was designed for many things, but this was one of the things. First, we have to make sure we still have electricity when we get there, so we extend the solar panels. But once we head into the atmosphere, as we can see here, we have to retract that, otherwise it would burn up and it is gone. Alright, the tricky part here, really tricky part, was to actually hit land. Because with all of those visual mods, it is hard to make out anything on the surface, which was already a bit of a gamble on Eve. But after a few, well, let's say mishaps, we finally found a piece of land where we could land on, and this is some sort of valley. It's hard to see now until we have the sun rising, but first we have to land here safely, and for that we also need the engines. The parachutes help a lot more than on Duna, but we also need some propulsion to get to a velocity that is safe for landing, and that's what we're doing right now. And thankfully we have those headlights on the bottom that can show us where we land. And land we did. We landed on Laythe, and now we just have to wait for the sun to rise. And there it comes. Here we go. Look at that beautiful vista. I think Laythe is one of the most beautiful destinations you can visit in stock or modded KSP, and modded even more so, especially with all of these surface features that were added by the Parallax mod. And now we have to do the usual things we do when on a planet. Improve Laythe's handicap, and of course plant a flag. And after that's all said and done, we have to get to roving and looking for surface features to scan with our arm. And when we find one over here on the left, we make our turn around that, and we see two more up there on the ridge, some kind of geyser. We're going to check that out later. But first we're going to use our scanning arm to scan this while we look at Jewel hanging in the sky over there. Isn't that beautiful? I think it is. What do you think? Tell me in the comments. And now we're at the geyser, of course in a safe parking spot, because we don't park at the side where the hot water is dropping. And once we got all that data, it is time to head back down to the valley and into the lander, because yes, we want to get back to Invictus and continue our mission. There's more planets to explore, more moons to scan, more surface features to find. But first we have to launch. There we go, and off it is. Also we have to retract the landing gear. Then we see some volcanic activity, also provided by the volumetric clouds of the environmental visual enhancement mods. There we can see them again. And now we have to use the Invictus itself to get to the rendezvous with the lander, because the lander is basically dry now. All of that atmospheric drag and also Laythe's not minuscule gravity makes it hard for vehicles to get back up from the surface. And now we're back. We're refilling the lander with the stored propellant, because we're heading to our next destination, which is Vall. Yes, the icy mistress awaits us. And of course, again, as usual, we have to perform some more burning of some more propellant. And while we do that, we can see Jewel hanging in the background while the Invictus graciously soars through space, and we get our periapsis for Vall. Moving along outside of the sphere of influence of Laythe, we get our usual song and dance of dancing planets around Kerbal. Kerbal, of course, I meant Jewel. I'm sorry, I'm talking for over an hour straight. And now we're in orbit around Vall, almost. Now not almost, now we are. But we still have to do more. We want to get a perfect circularization going on. And that's why Stelnitzer Kerman has a very close eye on the maneuver node. While Dumor Kerman does his usual maneuver, sort of getting the science from the rover that it brought back from Laythe. And now all that is done, we get the lander out the back. And yeah, I close the docking port all the time, although I would not need to, because there's no atmosphere on Vall. This is only necessary basically on Duna, Laythe, and on a few select celestial bodies of the Outer Planet mod, which we will get to in part 2, because part 1 is basically a grand tour of the stock Kerbal system, And in part 2, we're going to make a grand tour sort of the outer planets. Something I already did with the Ozymandias, but I never did a whole grand tour plus outer planets, sort of a GTO. You know, GT, Grand Tour, O, Outer Planets, GTO. Yeah. Anyway, we are now back with the rover, and we also have our banana. We're still going to smash it, and it's still going to hurt when we hit the hammer on our fingers. And we also plant our flag, and now that that's done, we can search for more surface features, which is over here. And we see, oh, what's that? While we scanned for this one, we saw some volcanic activity in the back. That's what we're going to check out after. So first we scan this little black rock, and then we're going to scan this ice volcano, which is kind of a weird name. And we also see there's the lander in the back waiting for us to return. So can ice be volcanic? I am not sure that science would agree, at least not human science, but Kerbal science might be a different thing. Alright, but what is the same is rocket engineering. You put propellant in a rocket, you heat it up, you create exhaust gas, you push yourself away. So that works, and because it works so well, we can perform spaceflight. And while we do that, of course, we get a rendezvous with the main Invictus ship and get ourselves in the back. Yeah, nighttime docking, so not much to see except the lighting of the ships. But now, our final destination, Paul. This is one last stop before we head out further into the solar system, into the outer planets. But this is another little nugget of rock we have to visit, and in order to do that I had to do some adjustments to its orbit, because it's really hard to get a very precise you have to do a very precise maneuver to even get there, because Paul is so tiny and minuscule that it has a very low gravity, and therefore it is hard to get captured around it. But in the end we of course managed it, and of course we need some more fuel, because from here we head out to the other planets of course, and therefore we're going to need to know where the fuel is on Paul. And for that we use our scanner, and here it is. Now we know. Now we get the scanner back on board, and then we get our lander, well, not the lander, our entire ship ready to land. One last time in this video. Stelnitzer, Laythe, Denmont, Thompson, Edbury, Kerbal, Katitza, Tootfrot, all of them, they're going to be very glad when all of this is over in a few decades, but they are also glad that this important milestone is now done. Well, not completely done, because first we have to grab all the science that we can get from here. So, rover, get back out of there. Yeah, here we go. And after we get out of the rover, we do our usual science experiments and also our commemorative flag planting. There we go. Now everybody knows we were here, if they should find the flag in the future. Alright, but what we haven't done yet is scan a surface feature, and that's what we're going to attempt here. So we have this little thing. This does not look like anything else around here, so might be a good idea to scan it, which is what we're doing right now. And yeah, this is definitely a surface feature. By the way, look at how well Invictus blends into all of these little spikes on Paul, whatever they're made of. And of course, then it is time to head back inside and wait for Invictus to be refueled, and then wait for our transfer to Sarnus. This basically concludes our epic journey across all planets and moons of the Kerbal system. I hope you enjoyed this rather lengthy video, and I hope you will also tune in the next time we continue the Invictus saga when we visit the outer planets. As I mentioned already, this is basically my farewell to Kerbal Space Program 1, because I plan to play Kerbal Space Program 2 when it comes out in the end of February a lot and won't have much time for KSP1, or at least not for missions as big as this one. So I wanted to do this to show off basically everything I learned over the course of the years I played this game. Visit every planet that is available, show it to you, and show it to you in the best light possible with the best visual mods around. So if you enjoyed this, please subscribe, please join my Discord and my socials, links are in the description, maybe subscribe to Patreon, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.